Few people could have imagined that the future talented doctor would be declared dead within 8 minutes. But then, when they were about to take him to the morgue, he suddenly showed signs of life. When he regained consciousness, he told something that shocked the entire medical staff of the hospital. Every year, science and humanity learn more and more amazing things and discoveries about the invisible world. The story that will be told in this video is one of the most vivid and amazing that I have ever heard of. She turned my mind upside down. Enjoy watching. I heard the amazing story that happened to the famous American psychiatrist George Ritchie at his lecture in 1965. At that time, I was a student of a psychiatry course, and until that moment, I did not believe that anything else could happen after life. Thanks to Dr. Ritchie's story about the afterlife, I began to actively explore this phenomenon, recalls another doctor, Raymond Moody. The details of Ritchie's story inspired Moody to experiment, which formed the basis of his famous book, Life After Life. This is how it describes a typical near-death experience that Moody constructed based on a survey of numerous patients who had experienced clinical death. A person hears a doctor pronounce him dead. He feels as if he is moving very fast through a long, dark tunnel. Suddenly, a person discovers that he is outside his body. Now, from an observer's position, he is looking at his own dead body from a distance. Highly agitated, he is present at this strange observation post and monitors the attempts to bring his body to its senses. Other creatures approach the dying person to greet him and help him. A person sees the spiritual essences of deceased relatives and friends, and a luminous being radiating warmth and love appears in front of him, which he has never seen before. A panorama of the most important events of his life flashes before a person. At this point, it becomes clear to him that he must return to Earth for the time being, since the time of his death has not yet come. A person resists this. He is captivated by the experience of the afterlife, and he does not want to return. He is overflowing with joy, love, and peace. Despite his inner resistance, a person inexplicably reconnects with his physical body and comes to his senses. In the future, trying to tell other people about his experiences, he faces great difficulties. A person cannot find the appropriate words in the language that would make it possible to describe the unearthly events of his experience. People are often ridiculed and completely stop sharing their memories of postmortem experiences. Nevertheless, these impressions leave a deep mark on his life. They influence how a person begins to relate to death and realize his attitude to life. But let's return to the story that prompted Moody to do such research. It happened in 1943. 20-year-old Ritchie ended up in the hospital, where doctors pronounced him dead as a result of pneumonia. He remained in this state for 8 minutes. George Ritchie described everything that happened to him during this time in his book, Return from Tomorrow. After graduating from high school, George Ritchie was going to become a doctor, and he was supposed to start studying at the medical college in Richmond in September. However, this was not to be, as he was drafted into the Army that same month. Shortly after, he was sent to Texas to Barkley Army Camp. In December, he contracted bilateral pneumonia and was admitted to an Army hospital. Ritchie was lying alone in the isolation ward and dying quietly. The miraculous penicillin was not yet known. At some point, the orderly could not feel his pulse. There was no breathing and no heartbeat. The doctor who was called pronounced him dead and ordered the corpse to be taken to the morgue. When the orderly returned to the room 8 minutes later with a gurney, it seemed to him that the patient's arm had shifted slightly away from its previous position. He called the doctor again, and upon a cursory examination, he again announced that the patient was dead. The orderly did not want to believe that Ritchie was really dead and asked the doctor to inject adrenaline directly into the heart muscle. Both doctors thought it was unlikely to change anything, but after the injection, a pulse appeared, blood pressure and breathing were restored. Ritchie remained in a coma for 3 more days and finally regained consciousness. When George woke up, the clinic staff told the patient the story of his death and his happy resurrection from the dead. In response, the young man told about what happened to him in those minutes when he did not show signs of life. That night, George Ritchie woke up in his room. The patient felt completely healthy. He decided to go out into the hall to find a doctor and tell him about the improvement of his condition. He wandered through the deserted hospital corridors until he saw a nurse approaching him, carrying a tray of instruments. Ritchie went to meet him. The guy was glad to meet at least someone who was awake. He asked the nurse, "Excuse me, have you seen the doctor by any chance?" However, he did not notice the patient and was heading straight for him. At the last moment before the collision, George screamed to get the medic's attention and jumped aside. The young man could not understand why they did not pay attention to him. He decided to return to his room. When I returned, I saw that someone was lying on my bed with a sheet over his head. From under it, only an arm could be seen, which was hanging down. Looking closer, I noticed on this hand a black onyx ring with a small golden owl. The numbers 19 and 45 were engraved on the ring. I realized that this was my ring, a gift from my grandfather. It was on my finger, and it was my dead hand that was hanging powerlessly from the bed. At that moment, I couldn't believe that this had happened to me. George Ritchie recalled. The young man thought that he was going to become a doctor, and in a few days he was supposed to sit at a festive table with his family. Now it's all gone. George recalled that he had never felt such overwhelming loneliness and confusion as at that moment. Ritchie wanted to see his family. And as soon as he thought about it, he found himself outside the hospital. He was flying over the ground at a tremendous speed, it seems dozens of times faster than the speed of an airplane. He was neither warm nor cold. He saw everything from above, from a bird's eye view. His mind was telling him that it was impossible. And yet, it was a reality. Ritchie flew over the twinkling lights of unfamiliar cities. These were mainly traffic lights. Ritchie could see the streets, but few cars were passing at that hour of the night. The cities he flew over seemed dark and calm. Ritchie was flying to his hometown, Richmond. Ahead, a large high bridge spanned the river, on the banks of which a huge city was located. George wanted to go downstairs so that someone could tell him where to go next. He was surprised to find that his flight speed had dropped, and then he stopped altogether. Ritchie saw a building with a red roof and a sign on the wall that said, "Cafe." He was floating in the air at a height of about 15 meters when he suddenly noticed a man below. That's who you can ask for directions from. A moment later, Ritchie found himself walking along the sidewalk next to a pedestrian. My thoughts control my movements, he realized. The man was about 40 years old. He was wearing a warm coat. Ritchie asked him, "Excuse me, please, what kind of city is this?" The man walked on as if he hadn't heard him. George spoke louder. "Please tell me. I'm a stranger here and—" They approached the cafe, and the man reached for the door handle. Perhaps the person was deaf and dumb? Ritchie lightly touched the man's shoulder with his left hand. A hand went through his shoulder. The man opened the door and disappeared inside the establishment. He left the elusive man alone and wanted to lean against a telegraph pole to think about what was going on. The body passed through the pillar as if it were not there. Ritchie was lost in thought. The man from the cafe, the telegraph pole. What's going on here? Apparently, I've lost my ability to connect with things around me. Obviously, this man didn't see me, and neither did the nurse at the hospital. I just don't exist for them. Why would I fly to Virginia? Probably no one from my family will see me either. Listen to what George wrote about his experience 43 years later in the book Return from Tomorrow. Death is instantaneous. Now you are in your physical body, and in a moment you are already outside of it. You can see this old body, but you are no longer a part of it. It's dead, but trust me, you're not dead. Contemplating your body lying on the bed, realizing that you are not in hell or heaven, realizing that you cannot contact other people, creates a feeling of complete isolation. It was terrible to realize. But maybe everything can still be fixed if you hurry up and immediately return to the hospital, to your body. Otherwise, his disembodied spirit risks being lost forever under the endless stars. In this dream, all the wishes of the young man came true. Suddenly, George Ritchie returned to the hospital. He tried to remove the sheet from his body, but he couldn't. Ritchie didn't know what to do or where to go. This caused him unbearable suffering. Suddenly, the small space of the isolation ward was brightly illuminated, as if 1,000 lamps had been switched on at once. Someone made up entirely of light entered the room. It was God, the Son of God. Ritchie could feel the unconditional love coming from him. At that moment, he saw a panorama of the most important events of his life. He recalled everything, starting with the birth by cesarean section and ending with thousands of other scenes from his life. He remembered all the events of his life, negative and positive. Then Ritchie found himself already outside the hospital. The panorama of his life was gone. Together with the creature of light, George flew high above the ground, heading for a distant, shining point. On his first lonely journey, he had only slightly risen above the surface of the earth, but now he and the glowing satellite were much higher and moving much faster. The shining dot in the distance turned out to be the city in which they landed on the ground. There were many buildings, smoking pipes, factories and factories. There were people here who didn't have physical bodies. Ritchie described some of the scenes. He saw people quarreling, choking with hatred for each other. Often the scandal turned into a violent fight. The translucent bodies couldn't do any damage to the opponent, but there was real rage on the faces of the combatants. Those who did not participate in the quarrels remained completely indifferent to what was happening. Ritchie calls this city hell and claims that unhappy people are on that level. Ritchie and the glowing creature took off again and continued moving forward, opening a new horizon in front of them. The quality of the light has changed. I gradually began to perceive a new level. Huge buildings towered over a beautiful, sunny park. It seemed that we had suddenly entered a completely different dimension, a different kind of existence. There was peace all around. Ritchie describes the buildings, the people who worked there, the light around them, the joy and concern for the well-being of others. Suddenly, the picture of the surrounding world changed again. Then the guy ended up in the labs. The devices that George saw here surprised him. He couldn't figure out how they worked. It wasn't until 10 years after his near-death experience that Ritchie saw a picture of an atomic reactor in a scientific journal. This photo amazed George. After all, this is exactly what Ritchie saw back in 1943 during his journey to other worlds. When I left the engineering laboratory, a dark corridor opened up to me, flying through which I could see various events awaiting humanity in the future. I have witnessed a great many natural disasters and catastrophes. I've seen explosions like I've never seen before, and the world only found out about them in August of '45. After that, the glowing creature mentally made it clear to me that I should go back. The next moment, George was looking at the familiar ring on his own hand, but now he could see it with his normal vision. Ritchie is convinced that he was brought back to earthly life so that he could tell people that they could make their material world a paradise on Earth if they wanted to. In January 1944, after recovering, Ritchie was sent to Virginia to continue his medical studies. And in early October of the same year, he and 2 medical students were driving in a battered Plymouth to Texas. None of them had ever traveled from Virginia to Texas before, so they didn't know how to navigate the tangle of highways and often got lost. They passed Louisville and Memphis. On the 3rd day, they arrived in Mississippi and drove towards Vicksburg along the east bank of the river. For many kilometers along the banks of the river, there were fields of corn and sugarcane, and in front of them on a hill lay the city of Vicksburg. "Do you see any signs?" the driver asked George, who was acting as navigator today. Ritchie couldn't answer him. His mouth went dry and his stomach twisted as they drove the last kilometer to the city. It was his first time in this place, but he definitely recognized the riverbank, could tell where the next turn would be. The intersections of the roads were familiar, and it immediately became clear to him that a block down the street would lead them to a building with a red roof and a neon cafe sign. Then, Ritchie asked the driver to drive straight ahead and follow his instructions. They reached the block where the 24-hour cafe was located. "Here's the sidewalk where I was walking with a man who didn't see me. There's a telegraph pole I stopped by. I wonder how long I've been standing there." He wanted to jump out of the car, run across the street to the telegraph pole to hug him. He longed to open the door to that cafe. It was here in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Here I interrupted my disembodied flight. Here I stopped and thought about what I should do next. When I got to that cafe, I felt goosebumps running through my body. After all, death is a great illusion. It's not the end of everything. It's just a door that you walk through to the next room, concluded George Ritchie. Do you think there is life after death? Write your opinion in the comments. If you want to learn more about life after death and the afterlife, then I recommend watching my other videos. Please don't forget to like this video if you liked it. See you soon and have a nice day.